Bad news? You're being raided by the Vikings. Good news? You might be able to avoid some of their more creative torture methods. To die in the middle of a Viking raid was brutal and bloody, but for the most part, it was also quick. Early Viking raids were relatively small, extremely brutal, and tended to be over very quickly. And while you wouldn't want to find yourself caught up in one, they weren't anything people weren't already used to. It was the late 8th century when the Vikings appeared in Britain, after all, a time when you could wind up in anything from a massive battle to a skirmish between rival families or towns. It wasn't an easy time to live, and the Vikings were just one more headache for people to deal with. Don't cry too many tears over those who died in the Viking raids then. It was the survivors who had it much, much worse. Monasteries and churches were always favorite targets for the Vikings. For the rest of the world, anyone who would defile sacred places and murder God's servants was nothing short of wicked. This was a time when religion was at the heart of life for many towns and people, and that made the Vikings' disrespect of God's domain even worse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the Vikings as wild heathens who trampled upon saints' bones and destroyed God's house.
This is their God, and he's dead. He's nailed to a cross.
Vikings looted many of the monasteries and churches they raided, stealing pretty much anything they could get their hands on. In some cases, they even stole ornate reliquaries that were used to hold sacred saints' relics. For a Christian, this would be more or less unthinkable. Perhaps unsurprisingly, people at the time struggled to discern the Vikings' motivations, and many came to the conclusion that they were the physical manifestation of God's fury. Scribes and monks lamented the violence and crime they saw in the world around them, and wrote that the Vikings had been sent to deliver retribution on morally corrupt people of the world. Others referenced terrible omens that heralded the coming of Vikings, including great lightning storms, famine, and even dragons. Today, we can only imagine the fear that the victims of these raids must have felt to come face to face with the wrath of God. Vikings didn't only raid to loot and kill, they also sought to reinforce a vital part of the Viking economy, slavery. Most Viking slaves were taken from the British Isles and Eastern Europe. Occasionally, native Vikings who committed crimes at home were also reduced to the status of slave. While there's not a lot of contemporary evidence regarding the lives of Viking slaves, archaeologists have been able to piece together a few details. Thousands of people could be enslaved in a single Viking raid. Many were sold to the Vikings' countrymen in Scandinavia who had stayed at home to work the fields. Wool was a huge industry at the time, as it was needed for the ship's sails, and archaeological evidence indicates that many slaves ended up laboring on huge plantations. Ancient poems suggest they were given names like Bastard, Stumpy, and Stinker. And when they died, they were just left laying around as food for dogs and birds. For some idea of how much or little a human life was valued, consider this. Viking trade records show a female slave was worth the same as a cow and an ox, while 4 male slaves had the same worth as 2 horses, or a suit of chainmail. There can be little doubt that every day of a Viking slave's life is going to be filled with fear, starvation, abuse, and backbreaking labor. Norse beliefs held that it wasn't just the rest of a slave's life that was going to be hard, however. As far as they were concerned, the afterlife wouldn't be much better. Researchers have discovered numerous Viking burial sites in which both men and women were interred with grave goods. These items were offerings that the deceased could take into the afterlife. It tended to include weapons and jewelry, some of which came from far afield.
What else have we got here?
Well, we have some brooches, and then we have the Buddha.
Buddha.
But many Vikings share their graves with other bodies, which show signs of malnourishment, injury, and a brutal death. Those are the slaves who were sacrificed and buried with their masters so they could serve them for eternity in the afterlife. It gets worse, too. Almost every Viking slave burial site has been different in some way, and this has led some archaeologists to put forward a terrifying theory. They believe that as part of the burial ritual, the Norse might have recreated important events from the life of the deceased, the slave standing in for the dead man. Did a dead man or woman lose a limb, get their teeth knocked out, or suffer some other catastrophic injury? Well, guess who had to recreate all that before they were sacrificed and tossed in the ground? Historian Mary Valenti has made a compelling and disturbing argument when it comes to the early Viking raids in Britain. She claims that when they attacked monasteries, the Vikings were looking to capture monks for a very specific reason. Buried in writings and biographies from the era are mentions of large numbers of slaves being transported from Western Europe through Italy and finally to Byzantium in the Middle East. These captives were then put to work as teachers, guards, and even harem servants. Those roles were important in these cultures, and they had to meet certain requirements. They needed to be literate, they needed to be educated, and they needed to be eunuchs. Valente argues that many of the monks, scribes, and acolytes taken from monasteries during Viking raids were young men who had the first 2 requirements covered, so when they were shipped off to Italy, they were castrated to fulfill the last one. Throughout the Viking era, demand for these eunuch slaves rose steadily, and there's a good chance that many of the men who didn't die in Viking raids ended up wishing they had. For a long time, historians have been trying to figure out just why the Vikings started raiding, and one still popular theory was suggested around 1,000 years ago by Dudo of St. Quentin. The basics are this: Vikings practiced polygyny, which is the idea that a man could not only take multiple wives, but also keep concubines. The more powerful the man, the more women he had. To each his own, right? Well, that's the problem. So many powerful Vikings were taking so many wives that each man didn't have his own. Research suggests that the large numbers of unmarried Viking men helped drive not just raiding parties, but the taking of female captives. There's a good chance those female captives were forced to return home with their Viking bachelors, where they would be put to work as domestic slaves and childbearing concubines. These unfortunate women were sometimes seen primarily as sex slaves, and when they did have children, one of two things could happen. The children could either be acknowledged as the official children of the father, or they could be forced into a life of slavery themselves. Many of the most well-known Viking torture methods walk the line between fact and fiction. It's unclear just how fictionalized some contemporary writings about the Vikings are, but the legends are a testament to how creative they seem to have been when it came to violence. First and most famously, there's the Blood Eagle. This has been described as the fate of several Vikings, but just how widely it was practiced is still up for debate, if it was ever practiced at all. The Blood Eagle involved carving the shape of an eagle into the victim's back, then cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling out the lungs so they looked like an eagle's wings.
I'm told it is the worst, most painful death of all, but astonishing.
Another kind of torture turned execution method is described in Jarl's saga, so it may or may not actually be true. After the Battle of Clontarf, Ulf Harada reportedly inflicted an ungodly amount of pain onto a fellow Viking named Brodir in retribution for killing an Irish king. Ulf, it was said, sliced open a bit of Brodir, pulled out some of his intestines, then ordered him to walk around and around a tree, pulling out the rest of his innards as he walked. That doesn't look so bad right now, does it? Sometimes the Vikings would like the look of the lands they raided, so they decided to stick around. This is exactly what happened in Iceland, and when the Norsemen decided to make the island their home, they set out to destroy its forests. Trees were used for construction, heating, and charcoal for forges, while the land was used for planting crops and grazing animals. Within a few hundred years, Iceland was left with a landscape that was almost entirely treeless. That was fine for the Vikings, of course, but in the 21st century, the repercussions have been devastating. With no trees to secure the soil against Iceland's brutal winds, erosion has become a major problem. The soil, which contains a lot of volcanic rock and ash, blows away with a force that could strip the paint off cars. This has made farming impossible, grazing land scarce, and sandstorms a way of life for Icelanders. It has even impacted Iceland's ability to regulate their emissions, as there are no trees to absorb the carbon dioxide produced by the country and its inhabitants. Iceland has been trying to re-establish their forests since the 19th century, when a devastating sandstorm buried much of Grunge, killing hundreds of livestock. Today, Iceland is still only around 1.5% forested, but there is finally some cause for optimism among rewilders.
The forests are growing better than anybody ever thought. People will more and more look at them and say, hey, this is something that's worth having.
By the time Ethelred the Unready became the king of the English at the turn of the 11th century, the Vikings had been raiding and pillaging their way up and down the British coast for around 200 years. Obviously, people had more than had enough of the Norse, an issue exacerbated by the fact that many of them never left. Ethelred's Britain was divided between Anglo-Saxons who lived in the south and the Danes who had settled in the north. Even though Viking settlers intermingled and in some cases intermarried with their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, much tension existed between the two cultures. This all came to a head when, after being informed that the Vikings were trying to kill him, Ethelred issued a call to arms. On November 13, 1002, he ordered his faithful subjects to kill all Danes living in Britain. It's unclear how many died during the St. Brice's Day massacre, but multiple mass grave sites have been found dating to the time of Ethelred's decree. Among them were a group who sought shelter in an Oxford church that was burned down by an angry mob outside, as well as that of Gunhild, the sister of Denmark's King Svein. Her death added still more fuel to the fire and eventually led to the largest Viking invasion that Britain had ever seen. Some of the survivors of Viking raids were simply too valuable to sell into slavery, but there's no telling how life was going to turn out for them. Some of the Icelandic sagas record the taking of hostages, including the tale of Olaf Tryggvason and Sigurd the Stout, in which Olaf takes Sigurd's son hostage as a guarantee that he will fall in line. It's believed by many that political hostages were taken more often than most would expect, and according to research from the New University of Lisbon, it was pretty common for Vikings to ransom them back to their families. Unfortunately, paying the ransom would often devastate entire families, leaving them destitute. Sometimes it just didn't work out for the hostages. One of the most well-documented instances of brutality against hostages comes from Canute the Great. Canute was forced to flee England for the safety of Denmark when the Anglo-Saxons refused to acknowledge him as his father's heir, and during his escape, he cut off the ears, noses, and hands of the hostages he had been given as a token of goodwill. Anything else, the Vikings believed would have been weakness.